Hi everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the prophetic literature. And you can see today we are at beautiful, lovely Dodger Stadium. We are on the west coast at Chavez Ravine. It's appropriate that we have this conversation about the posterior prophets out here because we are on a hilltop that overlooks downtown Los Angeles. That's right behind home plate. Whereas if you go out past center field, you're looking east to the beautiful hills that are to the east of downtown Los Angeles. So it's a beautiful sight not only for a ball game, but for a conversation about some other events that happen on a hilltop, Mount Zion. Most of the posterior prophets are focused on what the Lord is doing on Mount Zion. Whether it's Isaiah talking about all the nations coming to receive instruction, Torah on Mount Zion, to the prophet Jeremiah giving his famous temple sermon, telling the people not to presume on the Lord's presence on Mount Zion, or Ezekiel talking about the glory of the Lord leaving Mount Zion and then coming back and being restored, or whether it's the minor prophets dealing with it in their own special ways, many of the posterior prophets, not all, but many, most, focus on Mount Zion. So it's appropriate that we're here at Dodger Stadium. Today's class is going to be an overview of the entire corpus of the posterior prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets. We'll also, following the Christian canon, talk about the books of Lamentations and Daniel, as well as, in the Catholic canon, the deuterocanonical book of the prophet Baruch, which is long associated with the book of Jeremiah and fits within the prophetic canon here in our Catholic tradition. So we're going to be looking at a general overview, and this will set the stage for the rest of the course, where we're going to look at all of these books individually as they occur within the canon. So to introduce the posterior prophets, I like to use an image of the what I call prophetic pigeonholes. You can see them on your screen. As you see, we've got 4 rows of pigeonholes, 4 rows of books that I want us to think of in the same breath. What we're going to do in this course, we're going to look at the 3 major prophets first. We're going to look at Isaiah, we're going to look at Jeremiah, and then we're going to look at Ezekiel. We're going to spend 2 weeks talking about Isaiah, then we'll spend a week talking about Jeremiah, and then another week talking about Ezekiel. Then we're going to look at each of the different sets of minor prophets. We're going to look at Hosea, Amos, and Micah, this first row of minor prophets. And then we'll look at Nahum, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk, our second row of minor prophets. Then, the following week, we'll look at Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and then Joel, Obadiah, and Jonah. And then finally, we'll look at the book of Daniel in our last week of class. We'll also look at the book of Lamentations as well as the book of Baruch. These 2 slightly different books that are traditionally associated with the book of Jeremiah. We'll look at all of those as we conclude the course. I associate these books on these rows, one, because it's a way of remembering them, and also keeping straight when they're set. So this first row, which includes the major prophet Isaiah and the minor prophets of Hosea, Amos, and Micah, they all have in common that they are set in the 8th century. All of these books are dated to the era when Assyria was either getting ready to or was actively becoming the great power, the great empire controlling the ancient Near East. The books of Hosea and Amos are the 2 earliest books of the posterior prophets. They are quite possibly the earliest books of the entire Old Testament. There's dispute about that, but a lot of scholars think that. Hosea and Amos are unique in a couple of other respects. They're unique in that they are both directed toward the northern kingdom. Hosea and Amos are directed to the northern kingdom. Hosea the prophet marries the prostitute Gomer, and they have 3 children which are symbolic of how the northern kingdom has fallen from whom they're supposed to be. The book of Amos is best remembered for its emphasis on social justice. So Hosea and Amos are directed to the northern kingdom. Hosea is a northerner. Amos is a southerner who goes and preaches to the northern kingdom. Isaiah is an 8th century prophet living in Jerusalem during the eras of King Ahaz, during the Syro-Ephraimite War under Tiglath-Pileser III in the 730s BC. He would also be a prophet ministering to King Hezekiah at the end of the 8th century in 701 BC, when the Assyrian king Sennacherib threatened the very existence of Jerusalem. Micah from Moresheth was more of a rural prophet. He and Isaiah overlap. So these 4 prophets are associated with the 8th century. Now keep in mind, these books are set in the 8th century, but that does not mean that they all were completely written in the 8th century. Especially with Isaiah, we're going to see reason to believe that the book was begun in the 8th century and then augmented in later centuries. Our second row dates to the late 7th century, possibly even the early 6th century. These prophets minister between the reign of King Josiah and the Babylonian exile. They're living during the changing of the guard, as the Assyrian Empire wanes, but then the Babylonian Empire begins to wax. Nahum is going to gloat at Assyria's misfortune as they lose power. But Zephaniah and Habakkuk are going to predict dour days to come for Judah. Zephaniah and Habakkuk speak to why the exile is coming to the southern kingdom. And then Jeremiah's prophetic career begins during the reign of King Josiah and will continue after the Babylonian exile. So the second row is the immediate lead up to the Babylonian exile. Our third row, these are our prophets that begin during the exile and continue after the exile. The prophet Ezekiel is a priest who is taken captive in the first exile, the first captivity in 597 BC. He begins his prophetic career already in exile in modern-day Iraq. The three minor prophets on this row, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, all speak to how Israel rebuilds itself after the exile, rebuilding the temple in Haggai. Zechariah and Malachi answer the question, now what? How are we to live? They're writing in the late 6th and throughout the 5th centuries BC. This brings us to our last row, which you can see I describe simply as question mark, question mark, question mark. We have the minor prophets of Joel, Obadiah, and Jonah, and then the major prophet of Daniel. Daniel, incidentally, is known as a major prophet in the Christian tradition. In the Hebrew canon, he's not a prophet at all. He's simply one of the writings. And indeed, the book of Daniel is more apocalyptic than classically prophetic. We'll talk more about what I mean by that later on. Daniel, as we'll discover later on, Daniel is a book that is set during the Babylonian exile, but we think was in fact written during and in response to the Maccabean period, the Maccabean revolt later on. That's in the 2nd century. These three other minor prophetic books, Joel, Obadiah, and Jonah, they all have something tricky about them. They're not so easy to date. There's a lot of speculation. Joel, there aren't any internal dating features to that book. With Obadiah, there's a character by that name mentioned in 1 Kings who would have ministered in the 9th century during the time of King Ahab, but we don't think that the canonical book of Obadiah is connected to that Obadiah, but rather seems to fit better along during the exile or shortly thereafter. And then the book of Jonah is also just odd. It's difficult to date. There's a lot of difficulties with that book, so we'll explore all of those a little later on. Our task as we go through the second part of the course, as we go through all of these books, is really threefold. First, we're going to seek to understand each book as it has been transmitted to us. That's a synchronic approach. One thing I'm going to do that's a little different from the way some people teach prophets, I'm going to teach all of Isaiah. Even though it seems to have been written across several centuries, my number one task is to figure out, how does it all fit together? Why did this book come together the way the tradition has come to know it? Then secondly, we're going to do the diachronic task. Explore how the text may have evolved over time. We'll try to hypothesize and figure out, how did we get from the events in antiquity to the form of the text that we have today? And then third, discover the message communicated by the text in its literary fullness. Most of these books are poetry. We want to drink in the imagery and really understand, what is the prophet trying to tell his contemporary audience, and why was this book accepted as canonical? What value did it seem to be understood to have had back in antiquity, and does it continue to have even to the present moment? Notice lastly 4 distinct moments in the development of these books. There's a setting where the book is set. That's often available via the superscription, but it doesn't necessarily follow that the book was composed at that time. There can be a separation between a setting and the composition. Then it could have been augmented later on and redacted, and then at some point it was accepted into the canon. Israel received it as authoritative. Keep in mind, at the time of Jesus, the debate was not over whether the prophets were authoritative. All but the Sadducees agreed on that much. The debate between the early Christians and the Jews who did not believe in Jesus was rather, given that the prophets are authoritative, what do they mean? I look forward to exploring these matters in greater detail later in the course. Until then, read well and pray well.